our first speaker for this morning, James Cantor. As you're going to learn, James' research, I've known him, it's a pleasure to do so because I've known him for quite a few years. We had the unique fun of being able to work together at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health here in Toronto for quite a few years, and continuing to collaborate through ATSA and through the ATSA journal, Sexual Abuse. James' research is focused on the development of atypical sexual behavior, particularly pedophilia and hebephilia, sexual orientation and hypersexuality. And in particular, I think he's really drawn a lot of attention. I know a lot of people in this audience are familiar with his work on the role of the brain in pedophilia, as we're going to hear later today. It's been published in such prestigious journals as Psychological Bulletin and the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. It's really amazing to me because James is the most recent star in an amazing scientific tradition at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. As you heard yesterday in the plenary presentation by Bill Marshall, in a lot of ways, one of the founders of our field here in North America was Kurt Freund, who, when he escaped Czechoslovakia, moved to the Maudsley for a period of time and then moved to Canada, where he established the first phallometric laboratory at the then Clark Institute of Psychiatry. And then over the next several decades, published some of the key work on the development and assessment of pedophilia. That tradition was taken up by Ray Blanchard, who you also know for his tremendous work on pedophilia, hebephilia, and again, the development and assessment of those sexual interests. Not to put any pressure on James, but I like to point out that Kurt Freund was the first, having just been able to recognize and honor Art Gordon for his work. Kurt Freund was the first recipient of the Lifetime Significant Achievement Award at ATSA in 1988, and Ray Blanchard received the award very well deservedly received the award last year in 2010, so no pressure, James. James Cantor is an associate professor in psychiatry at the University of Toronto, and as you know, he's the editor-in-chief of ATSA's journal, Sexual Abuse. He's a registered clinical psychologist and head of the Law and Mental Health Research Section at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. He completed his doctoral degree in clinical psychology in 1999 at McGill University, where he studied the neuroendocrinology of sexual functioning, specifically looking at the effects of antidepressant medications on sexual behavior in an animal model. I'm told with good authority that he is possibly the first, certainly one of the very few doctoral candidates who broke into song in his oral defense. Those of you who know James personally know that he knows pretty much a show tune for almost every occasion. And it's my genuine, sincere hope that we might get a number or two during this morning's presentation. I'm not sure what show tunes can fit with brain research and pedophilia, but if there is one, he knows it. His presentation today is entitled Brain Research and Pedophilia, What It Means for Assessment, Treatment, and Policy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. James Cantor.
Perfect, thank you. Great. Somehow, after introductions like that, I should feel like I always should just call it a day and go home. It can go nowhere but down from here. Now, I'd like to talk today, of course, about the great research that my colleagues and I have been doing now for almost 10 years, which is, I think, also a scary thing to be able to say, here in Toronto at CAMH. Now, studying the brain is one of those topics for which everybody immediately recognizes, good, I'm glad somebody's working on this because ultimately this might yield us some permanent solutions. But it's really, really tough to read. I mean, brain anatomy, anybody remember it? I mean, I also have to study the names of to be able to pronounce the different parts that as we're going through. So what I hope to be able to do today is to kind of translate some the more technical aspects and to emphasize what all of this really means. What all of the data that we're gathering means for what we know about pedophiles, what we know about the theory behind sexual offending, how we assess them, and how ultimately we can address the problems in society. Now, I think the reason that a lot of people are interested in the brain, philosophically, and how it relates to sexual offending is because of what I call the big questions. Whenever anybody asks, is it in the brain, really what people are asking is, can we change it? We used to ask a lot, is it in the genes? more or less for the same question. Well, if it's in the genes, then maybe we can't change it. We have the same idea. If it's in the brain, well, the brain doesn't change very much, maybe we can't change it. People also often start to believe, well, if it's in the brain, doesn't that mean that the people aren't responsible for their behavior? They can't control it. If they were born with it, well, that has following from that are all kinds of ethical implications and legal implications. So people become very anxious about what the results are, mostly because they're afraid that it's going to interfere with political beliefs that they hold. Yet, because the language of brain research is so complicated and the statistics are so hideously complicated, nobody's really sure exactly what the research is showing about the role of the brain in pedophilia and sex offending. So these are the questions that I kind of want to hit today after reviewing what we do know about the brain itself. Now, the role, I usually start with a slide that says, power corrupts. PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So when something goes wrong, think of that. Okay, modern sexology usually can be tracked back to this man, who was Austrian, Richard von Krafft-Ebing. It was started by a book that he published, Psychopathia Sexualis, which was the first attempt to start to catalog the many different types of sexual peculiarities of the day. And even though we often think of brain research as very modern, and most of us are accustomed to thinking about sex offending or pedophilia being something that's learned, something that developed from something that went wrong in the person's early environment, really at the very founding of sexology was the idea that pedophilia and the other paraphilias were actually the result of the brain. But in the 1800s, neither Krafft-Ebing nor any of his contemporaries had the technology really to follow up on the idea. So the idea just kind of was very easily subsumed, well, I shouldn't say subsumed under, but instead was overtaken by Freudian ideas at the time, which did relate whatever was going on in a person's life and their behaviors to their early experiences. Over the course of the 20th century, however, there were, especially following the Kinsey studies and Masters and Johnson's work, very large-scale studies. Every offender who went through a correctional system automatically got a battery of tests, including IQ testing. Now, IQ testing was interesting. You can almost think of it as a blood pressure test of the brain. It doesn't tell you exactly, it gives you a general idea of how healthy the brain might be. If you have a group of people who, as a whole, have low IQ, well, then there might be then you have the first reason to believe that there might be an involvement of the brain directly. Now, unfortunately, the IQ studies that have gathered over the course of the 20th century were highly contradictory. So the first thing that we did, everybody say, meta-analysis. So there were many different papers using sometimes enormous samples testing the IQs of sex offenders, including offenders against children, offenders against adults, non-sexual offenders, and then I grouped together all of the other studies that had samples of people who committed no offenses and people who had a mishmash of offenses. And sure enough, an average IQ, I put the gray line across, is 100. That's the population baseline average IQ. But the samples of people who committed offenses against children were substantially lower. And this is now over many tens of thousands of patients. The ends I have up here are numbers of studies in the meta-analysis rather than the actual sample size. So we did have some reason to think that, oh, there's something here going on. The sexual offenders against children, who of course have a large amount of pedophilia in them, have a significantly lower IQ than samples composed of people who committed other types of offenses. And what was interesting is that, of course, different papers use different definitions of what a child is when they talk about offenders against children. To some scientists, the victim was 18 or under. Some studies were more rigid. The victim had to be 16 or under, or 12 or under, and so on. But if you line up the average IQ of the sample with that definition of child, the lower the age definition of child, the lower the IQ in that sample. In other words, the more pedophilic the sample, the lower IQ in the sample. Again, that was a clue that there's something going on. But we're not quite sure what it is yet. It could be that low IQ offenders are more likely to get arrested. Although we get to compare this, also get to compare the offenders against children with offenders against adults who are also caught, and we still see the difference. The next large set of studies were using CT studies. If you remember, CTs were what MRIs used to be. In those days, there were two different theories being expressed. This is your brain. This is your brain in your head. So in smaller rooms, I usually like to stand in front of the projector, so the big brain kind of... Now, there were two theories going on at the time. I called them, or nicknamed them, the frontal lobe theorists and the temporal lobe theorists. And these two groups of scientists were debating for many years. This yellow area really depicts the main part of the frontal part of the brain. And the reason that people were suspecting that is that's the part of the brain that's associated with inhibition, or in brain injury, disinhibition, self-control. People with injuries in this part of the brain lose the ability to control their own behavior. People who are malformed or have less formed brain in this area of the brain are very impulsive. So there are some people who believe that sex offenses were the result of impulsivity and theorize, therefore, that it's this area of the brain that we would find differences in. Personally, I never bought the frontal lobe theory. Sex offenders are not particularly impulsive. There exist, for example, many pedophiles who are completely able never to offend. They're genuinely pedophilic, but if anything, they show a greater ability to inhibit their own behavior. Then there was the other group that I call the temporal lobe theorists. That's the temporal lobe of the brain, and it's kind of inside the temporal lobes that are what's called, remember the 4 F's? They were the 4 instinctual behaviors in humans. Fleeing, fighting, feeding, and fornicating. So really, if I had any theory of my own, I was probably a temporal lobe theorist. That's where the sexual parts of the brain are. To me, it made more sense that that's where, if something went wrong, that would be where it was. But I was essentially atheistic about it. Sorry, agnostic about it. Now, there are large neuropsychological batteries that were also going on at the time, and this was the basis of a lot of the debate between the temporal lobe theorists and the frontal lobe theorists. They tested many different types of sex offenders, but basically found nothing specific, nothing that replicated. Even from the same set of researchers, different sets of findings would emerge in different papers. So there's really nothing generalizable using those particular neuropsychological tests. But as time advanced, the researchers developed other kinds of tests which seemed to focus in more specifically on different parts of the brain. So usually by testing by giving a battery of these tests, we would come up with a profile. And that neuropsychological profile would give us an idea of how well different, more specific areas of the brain were functioning. So for example, we could test we could give a person a test that taps into the frontal lobe part, where we're testing a person's ability to inhibit or not inhibit. Unfortunately, there was nothing very consistent in these studies either. Most of them found non-significant results. Sometimes in large samples we got significant effects, but really anywhere in the brain. So overall, considered together, we found the same thing. Nothing specific, except some indication of there being some global, general, the whole thing just isn't working right, but nothing very specific. We couldn't find a pedophilia center, or they couldn't find a pedophilia center. Now, the early brain imaging, as I said, was a series of CT studies, but got pretty much the same problem. The early CT studies didn't have the resolution, the physical photography to be able to capture the brain. Here on the left is a contemporary CT scan where we have a nice, pretty clear picture where we can pick out some of the major structures of the brain. On the other side is the kind of CT scans that were available then. They couldn't really tell anything other than saying that those large holes, they're called ventricles, those large C-shaped dark spots in the middle, were larger, which essentially, and those are actually fluid, that center part. That's how a lot of the inner workings of the brain that need to circulate in fluid circulate. They were larger, meaning the rest of the brain was smaller. So we have the same story. We have just kind of a diffuse, non-specific, something's wrong, but we can't yet see what. So that then started the series of studies that I was able to do at CAMH, looking very, very indirectly at the brain. Now, the first thing that we wanted to do, again, was to replicate the basic IQ finding. Now, at CAMH, we test between 250 and 300 sex offenders per year. The majority of them are sex offenders against children. And it's a standard part of our assessment to include neuropsychological testing, including IQ testing. Because, of course, that gives us an objective means of knowing what kinds of treatment groups to assign a person to. We receive, as you might guess, very many low IQ people, and we put them in treatment groups that are lighter on, for example, reading materials or very, very complicated materials. Now, in our lab, of course, we also do philometry, which let me divide the groups according to the people who responded the most to pictures depicting children, stimuli depicting pubescent age children, roughly ages 11 to 14, versus, we call them the teleophiles, people who are sexually most interested in adults. So when I divide them according to their philometric results, I get the same, very dramatic differences in IQ. The teleophiles, again, not significantly different from the population average of 100. The pedophiles, however, were below 90. That's not, an IQ of 90 is not something where you would notice the person on the street that they're particularly unusual, not very bright, but you wouldn't say that this person is, that there's anything wrong with the person. But when you find the same thing in large groups of samples, and you find something systematic, from teleophilia to hebephilia to pedophilia, again, we're starting to see a pattern. We're not sure what it means. We're only testing the person, of course, often years after the offenses themselves, and we're still not sure, well, maybe it's the pedophiles getting caught that are more likely to appear in the samples and therefore interfere with our results. But I got the same thing with memory testing. I can imagine that a low IQ person is more likely to get apprehended by the police. It's a little bit harder to see how verbal memory might have that same pattern. But the pedophiles had the lowest memory scores. Same thing with visual memory, visual spatial memory scores, a very consistent pattern. Then it started getting interesting. Really, the question, is this in the brain? Well, when did it happen? Is this a brain injury? Is it something that developed along the course of life? Or is it something, the ultimate question, that was present since birth? Now, I can only test a person after they committed their offenses and after they come to the laboratory and are assessed. But there are some questions like this one. Just school age. Did they fail grades? Were they left back? Or contemporarily, nobody's left back anymore. They're instead assigned to special education classes, so I combined everybody into one sample. But the same pattern. In childhood, now predating the offenses, at least in the great majority of our offenders. Same pattern, where we had roughly 60 to 70% of them were assigned to special education or groups or failed a class. 70%. The baseline average is 2%. Something is going on, and it was present before they committed their offenses. It wasn't the result of the offenses, which actually, for a scientific pause, is interesting. Usually, in correlational data, you can't say what was cause and what was effect. But because I know this happened before the offenses, I know causality could not have been the other way. I still don't know if this is cause. They could both be caused by the same thing. If something's wrong in the brain, it could be causing both pedophilia and be causing the propensity to fail a grade or to need special education classes. We asked about head injuries. Again, these were historical head injuries, and they predominantly preceded the actual commission of the offenses. We found something here we weren't expecting. Although there was a significant and powerful association between having had a head injury, and a head injury severe enough to cause unconsciousness, and whether the person was pedophilic. But only if the head injury occurred before age 13. There was no association between whether the person had head injuries essentially after the onset of puberty. So again, because I can ask questions back in time, I can now say whatever was in the brain, all right, it was before high school graduation. Now I can say it was before puberty. Whatever happened was there early on. Physical height. They're shorter. Pedophiles are physically short, about 2.5 centimeters, which is roughly double the effect you would get if a woman smokes while she's pregnant with the kid. Whatever's going on is affecting the whole body, not just the brain. And then, perhaps most importantly on the whole thing, was handedness. Now, handedness is not a particularly obvious thing to want to ask about sex offenders. Who cares? I mean, we can imagine, is it left-handed pedophiles, they run the wrong way to escape the police and hit a wall. But what's scientifically important about handedness is there's only one thing that makes handedness: brain structure. It's one hemisphere of the brain versus the other hemisphere of the brain being the dominant one. No one controls that. There was, of course, some history, especially in Catholic schools, of trying to retrain kids to write with their right hand. That happens, but this is in excess of left-handedness. Nobody ever taught anyone to become left-handed. Anyone who is left-handed was born left-handed. Not only were they, we know that they were born left-handed rather than acquiring it early, because fetuses on sonograms have a preference for what thumb they suck still in the womb. And that thumb, of course, in later childhood and then adulthood, is their handedness. The baseline for left-handedness in the population is roughly 10%. Studies vary a little bit, 8 to 12. It's 30% in the pedophiles. The only other group I could find with that elevated a rate of left-handedness outside of gross brain injury are schizophrenics. Something is in the brain, and it was there before birth. There's just no other way to explain this. That doesn't rule out the possibility that there are social or more traditionally psychological contributors. There's no proof that demands that they be there, but there is no psychosocial way to explain height or handedness. Okay, so to sum up, we have lower IQs, lower scores on the memory tests, increased rates of grade failure, physical shortness or lesser stature, they call it in that literature, and less right-handedness. So altogether, we have pretty consistent results so long as you have a large enough sample to detect the effect. You have a homogeneous group of people, so they're purely pedophilic rather than a mix of pedophilic and non-pedophilic offenders. And in our case, we're able to use phallometric data in order to jump over people's self-report. So that then was the justification, and we got on one hand, I want to say large grant. On the other hand, I also like pointing out that the cost of the brain research that I'm about to show you was the same amount of money it takes to put one person in jail. Okay, now this is, of course, where it becomes much more specifically relevant to the day-to-day work that we do. This is, of course, the famous phallometric chair. This is the one in the Kurt Freund phallometric laboratory. So brain research, everybody wants to know, can we replace that with this? Which is a very, very exciting prospect. Okay, there have been only there are three teams doing this work. There's my group here in Toronto and two teams in Germany. And we're coming out with, I'll hold that part, and we're coming out with slightly different results. Now, I didn't set this up, but it worked out very nicely that one of these other teams was a group of temporal lobe theorists, and one of them was a group of frontal lobe theorists. So it made a very nice opportunity to see, oh, okay, who's going to win this? Now, the temporal lobe theorists tested, roughly over a dozen pedophiles plus controls from the community. These were healthy folks, volunteers essentially. And they did VBM analysis, which I'll talk more about later. Because they were looking specifically to find if there were deficits in the temporal lobe of the brain, they used what's called a small volume correction. The brain is, of course, enormous, and there are many, many different ways to analyze it, and points in the brain to analyze. The statistical folks among you will, of course, immediately start saying, oh, you have this multiple testing problem. Sooner or later, you're going to find something significant. The way to avoid that, or at least to minimize that in brain research, is to focus specifically on the areas of the brain you're interested in. So the temporal lobe theorists focused on the temporal lobe of the brain, and were indeed able to find in certain parts of the brain that there were less dense, areas of less dense gray matter. Fine. However, the frontal lobe theorists did exactly the same thing. They compared a relatively small group of pedophiles contrasting them with regular healthy controls from the community, and used a small volume correction because they were focusing specifically on the frontal lobe of the brain, and found that there were less dense areas in gray matter in the frontal lobe of the brain. Remember that famous story about the blind monks and the elephant? So the monks who were examining the tail of the brain would feel the tail and it's kind of fluffy. An elephant is much like a broom. And the guy at the side was feeling up, and it's large. Oh, yes, okay, elephants must be much like a wall. But if you step back and take all of the independent observations as one large set of findings, that's when you get to perceive the elephant. Unfortunately, when we look only at individual parts of the brain, we're only feeling around in either finding or not finding the specific thing we're looking for instead of getting the big picture. Now, because I was well supported, I hope somebody's here from CAHR, because I had the grant funding, I could gather a much larger sample. I didn't have to focus on any particular part of the brain. Every point in the brain had an even opportunity to come out as the significant point in the brain. Now, I can only do that because I was able to collect a relatively large sample, and for MRI research, they thought I was crazy for testing this many, but in retrospect, I'm glad I did. Okay, so this is the part that I want to talk about in a little more detail. Now, there's more than one way to decide who's genuinely pedophilic and who's not pedophilic, and people debate over the best way to analyze the brain and to decide who's in which group. Today, we only have time to go over this particular set of results, but they matched up pretty well. So we decided who was and was not pedophilic. If they said that they were pedophilic, we believed them. And if they didn't say they were pedophilic but had a series of offenses against kids, you were in the group anyway. Which brings me to VBM, which is a method of analyzing brain scan images, and it stands for voxel-based morphology, which of course brings the natural question, what's a voxel? Now, if you look at a television screen, or computer screen for that matter, you remember what a pixel is. It's one of those little points of light. A voxel is the same thing, but for the brain, in 3 dimensions, because I have a 3-dimensional image of the brain. So it's a volumetric pixel. But the basic idea is the same. It's a particular point in the brain, and when we have 2 groups, the computer then compares the density at these 2 points, then the next 2 points, then the next 2 points. And when you line up all of those, the computer then can recreate the entire thing into one large 3-dimensional image. So this is what we did. I'm going backwards. I can't blame this one, I guess, on PowerPoint. Okay, so again, the subjects themselves were recruited from the Kurt Freund laboratory, where we have large amounts of them. We offered them, I think it was about $150 to just sit in a noisy scanner and relax. The controls, however, were not regular controls recruited from the community. Because I never knew, we still had this question about, is disinhibition related? So I wanted to compare offenders against offenders. So just the propensity to break a law wouldn't be what I found. So rather than compare the pedophiles to healthy controls from the community, I compared who were predominantly sex offenders with people who committed non-sexual crimes. So theoretically, the propensity to commit any offense would be taken out of the equation. Now, they turned out to match very well in terms of IQ and everything else, except for alcohol. However, it was the non-sexual offenders who drank more. Now, since I'm pretty convinced that alcohol does not increase brain growth, I thought I was pretty safe to continue with the analysis. But that's what I found, and I panicked. Usually, a picture of the brain and the parts that are different between your 2 groups light up in bright colors, or we make the computers light them up in bright colors, and I just get this gray blob. Panicked. I absolutely panicked. I got nothing that looked like anything in the frontal lobe or in the temporal lobe. But what I got was something that none of us was expecting. It was inside a different layer of the brain altogether. Now, the turquoise part, if you imagine again the person stand, I guess I should stand that way. Okay, this way. So what's shown up in teal is really just the parts of the brain in the left hemisphere, and that kind of magenta color plus that extra blob showed up in the right hemisphere. So the two colors just make it easier to see. Now, this part doesn't always work. Ah. Thank you. Thank you. You have no idea how long I've been waiting to hear that. It's only my students who know how hideously complicated it is to get the bloody thing to do that. Okay, so we're now looking at the brain as if he's lying on the back, staring at the ceiling, and you can see those two very well-formed C-shaped areas. Now, all of this is in the white matter of the brain. Now, the white matter, you might remember, is the connective tissue. It's not the cell bodies. You remember that, the neuron has the cell body, and then it has that axon, that tail that connects it to the next neuron. Well, the brain has that in layers. The outer part of the brain is the large chunk of its gray matter, and then all that cabling goes underneath it to connect it to the various areas, and part of it, of course, forms the spinal cord. So it was symmetric, so this wasn't random, and I had an extra blob on the right side. Now, the names of the areas, in case anybody's curious, I put it in your slide packet. Everybody say it with me now. The superior occipitofrontal fasciculus. Try that over penile plethysmography. And the extra blob, which was only on one side of the brain, is the arcuate fasciculus. To me, it looks like Marge Simpson. Kind of with a frying pan. Okay, yeah, you're seeing it now. Now, the arcuate fasciculus in the left hemisphere actually is famous among neuroscientists because it connects Wernicke's area with Broca's area, the two major language areas. Nobody has any idea what it does in the right hemisphere. Of course. So those are the areas, it's white matter, but how do we interpret that? I mean, what does this actually say about pedophilia, and what does it say about brain growth, and what does it say about what we can do? Now, I also had absolutely no idea. I was expecting gray matter in one area, gray matter in another area. I would have been happy with a little blip someplace, but I ended up with two enormous tracts in the brain that were off, that were less dense, that were less well-formed. And it's connective tissue. It doesn't do anything. It's not a verbal area. It's not a nonverbal area. It's not a memory area. It connects areas. I couldn't get my mind around it. And then I had one of those lucky breaks that a scientist gets now and then. I'm sitting there just out of my mind, not getting this. And then there was another paper that somebody passed me, and it was on my desk. And then all of a sudden, I stepped back, and I saw the whole elephant. Now, the paper that I was reading was kind of a meta-analysis on its own. What people were asking, naturally, is what parts of the brain light up when somebody is sexually aroused? What are the sexually relevant parts of the brain? Now, what was interesting in that set of studies is that there is no one sex center of the brain. It's a network of several areas in the brain that seem to operate together. It connects the middle frontal gyrus is, again, the person essentially trying not to react while they're in the brain scanner. The area in the middle, the insula and opercula, are about sensory integration. The superior and inferior parietal lobules are about movement or about thinking about movement. And the occipital cortex is about vision. So if you put those together, those are just individual aspects of what a person in a brain scanner watching porn is thinking. Yes, the visual areas are lighting up quite strongly. The motor areas are imagining the interacting with whatever the subject of the film is. The sensory integration is, of course, the sensory integration, and the frontal lobe part, the inhibition areas, are the person, don't react, don't react, don't react, just kind of sit still while they're in the scanner watching porn. Now, this blue spaghetti kind of diagram was the result of an anatomical study that was looking at the superior occipital frontal fasciculus. And what that study showed was the different areas of the brain that connect, that network together the sex area, are all connected by the superior occipital frontal fasciculus. That can't be a coincidence. I mean, in theory, it could be a coincidence, but really what it looks like is the thing that goes wrong is that there's a problem not in the sex center, but in the network that altogether is responsible for identifying what in the environment is a potentially sexual object. It's almost like there's a literal cross-wiring. Humans, of course, have many social instincts. They include the 4 F's. They include, when you meet a person who's an alpha male, you either run away or obey them. If you're a child, there's natural instincts for learning. If you're a parent, there's a natural instinct for parenting. When you meet sexually interesting people, that's a natural social instinct. It's as if, this is a metaphor, not a conclusion, it's as if there's a literal cross-wiring, and when the person perceives a child, the brain, instead of triggering the nurturant instincts, is triggering the sexual instincts. It's cross-wired. At least that's a very, very helpful way so far to look at it that explains the data. So it looks like in pedophiles this white matter is underdeveloped, so the correct set of stimuli is not triggering the correct, I'll say correct, is not triggering the correct instincts. Now, so that's what I found, but we still have to puzzle together why did these 3 teams, me and the 2 groups of Germans, my group and the 2 German groups, come up with different results. I found nothing in the frontal lobes. I didn't really find anything in the temporal lobes either, although it's relevant to both the white matter cabling. So really, why didn't the 2 German teams find the white matter that I did, and why didn't I find the brain areas in gray matter that the 2 German teams did? I think it's a little bit complicated, but not too bad. The first part is, I think, sample size. The German samples were smaller than my samples, and it just didn't have the statistical power in order to find the white matter. The other problem, and for why didn't I find the gray matter, I think was the difference in our control groups. The 2 German teams used healthy controls from the community, and I used people who committed non-sexual offenders. So, of course, it's quite possible that the German teams weren't finding pedophilia, they were finding the propensity to break the law, which only their pedophilic group had. So if you line it up and you look up the brain literature on antisociality and psychopathy, and look up the literature also, interestingly, on adverse childhood events, which also trigger differences in brain development, all of the findings that were reported by the 2 German teams are indeed associated either with antisociality or with having suffered adverse circumstances in childhood, neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and so on. And it's only the white matter areas so far that seem to be associated only with pedophilia per se. And I say that very tentatively because those areas are not well studied at all. It's only been in the past, I'll even say 3 years, that brain scanning technology has advanced to the point where we can take a good close look at white matter differences. So although it hasn't been widely studied yet, we're getting there. We're getting there, and I think we're going to be seeing several studies of that kind soon. As a matter of fact, in the current project, I don't have the results yet, but in the current project, we're using something called diffusion tensor imaging, DTI, which is a specialized type of brain scan just for white matter. So the bottom line is, yes, it does look like pedophilia is in the brain. We're still disagreeing over where in the brain and what in the brain or why, but it does seem that there's something there. It's undeniable at this point to say about whether the brain is involved in pedophilia. However, we can't yet use a brain scan like this. We can't look at a person's brain structure and say, this is a pedophilic brain, that's not. The differences aren't large enough. But there's another kind of brain scan called a functional MRI. And for that, instead of looking at the brain as a clear, still image, it kind of takes a moving picture of the brain as the brain is reacting. Now, I have to backstep from that a piece. It's not actually looking at the brain, it's looking at the brain's blood flow. When brain areas are active, and the largest proportion of the blood in the body is actually in the brain and for the brain. That's where most of the blood oxygen goes to. Now, of course, when a brain area is active, it draws more blood, the blood vessels get larger, and it turns out that hemoglobin has different magnetic properties before and after it has oxygen, and the MRI can pick that up. Because the MRI can pick that up, it can tell us which parts of the brain are more active at any given time. So the way we do an fMRI study is you give a person a task, or in this case, you show them photos depicting either adults or children, or neutrals, and subtract point to point to point to point in the brain to see which parts of the brain are active at that given time when they're seeing one type of stimulus versus the other. Now, several researchers have done this already. The first set, again, mostly from the German teams, comparing various types. And what they found was that pedophiles light up in the same areas of the brain that non-pedophiles do, but they light up when they see the stimuli that they like. So a pedophile will light up when they see stimuli depicting children, and the non-pedophiles lit up when they saw stimuli depicting adults. However, those particular studies weren't designed to separate the two groups, which is unfortunate. There was one other study which looked specifically just at one part. I should say more about that. The reason that those studies, even though they could separate the two groups, even though they could say that pedophiles responded to children while the non-pedophiles responded to adults, but couldn't discriminate the two groups, is because there are so many points in the brain being examined. And so I have that same statistical problem that I had before. Which point in the brain do I look at as my basis for trying to separate the two groups? And because those two studies were capable of capitalizing on chance, they can't tell us in a statistically rigorous way who should belong to which group according to their results. This study, however, picked one point in the brain. They wanted the amygdala, which is often considered the center for emotion, especially in humans. And they did find that in the amygdala, the pedophiles, again, responded only to the stimuli depicting children, and the non-pedophiles responded to the stimuli depicting adults. The problem with this study is that they used homosexual pedophiles, that is, sex offenders against male children, but their controls were heterosexual. So in theory, I don't know if they were detecting homosexuality or if they were detecting pedophilia. And that used to be the end of the slide until 2 weeks ago, where Ponseti at Stillen Press in the Archives of General Psychiatry, I think it is, came out with a very, very interesting study, which is better formed and was designed specifically to see if an fMRI could separate these two groups, and found that they could. I think that with very, very few exceptions, with very few mistakes, could separate the two different groups. The problem with that study is that he used admitters rather than deniers. I shouldn't say problem with the study. Everything he did actually was correct. But we can't use it clinically yet because he only used admitters. Of course, if the person admits to being a pedophile, there's no point to the brain scan. We really need to know if we can detect this in deniers, in people who are trying to avoid or not react to the stimuli in the brain scanner. So the basic question, can an fMRI detect arousal to child stimuli? If there's a take-home message, it's how gray this bar is. We often want a very solid, concrete, yes he is or no he's not kind of an answer. Yes, this test works, no it doesn't. Philometry works or no it doesn't. Volumetric is better than circumferential or no it's not. But really all of these answers are statistical. There is no yes or no to any of them. Especially when it comes to medical testing, which often sets people to forget, well, it came back positive, that's that, as opposed to thinking of it in probabilities, which we're more accustomed to doing, especially in psychology. So what I put up here is a series of pretty well-known medical tests going from not very accurate tests, but still quite useful clinically, sometimes as a screening test, going from a digital exam of the prostate all the way up through the HIV antibody test, which is one of the most accurate tests. So this is where philometry is, or at least volumetric philometry, the way we use it in our laboratory. It's not perfect, and we're always very careful never to use it as if it's perfect. It misses a substantial portion of pedophiles, and it's biased on purpose. It's biased towards not diagnosing pedophilia. So when, from our laboratory, if a result comes out pedophilic, that's a solid result. We will only diagnose pedophilia if the person responds much more to the pedophilic stimuli than to the stimuli representing adults. This was the amygdala study. It did better than chance, but not really at the point where anybody would use it for a clinical purpose. And then this was the very recent Ponseti study, where he found very, very high sensitivity and specificity. But before I say, oh, it's up where all standard medical tests are, it's not quite ready, it's not quite yet ready for medical purposes. Nor is it necessarily better than philometry at this point. When we gather the data on philometry, of course, we gather the data on the deniers. Those are the people that we're most interested in. But the Ponseti study so far is on admitters. So we're getting there, but we're not quite there yet. Okay. Oh. Do we have the... I just want to see how my time is doing. Excellent, thank you. Okay, so overall, the features seem to suggest that there is definitely something prenatal that we can't get around. There's no way to explain the findings that we have in pedophilia without including biology. It's inescapable at this point. We can't rule out psychosocial influences, but we cannot have a complete theory that's not able to explain these non-obvious but exquisitely important biological findings. Now, the pedophilic brain structure does indeed seem to be different from the non-pedophilic brain structure. We're not exactly sure where yet, and we're not exactly sure how yet, and the differences are slight. We can pick them up when we have large groups to sample, but we can't see it on an individual brain scan. Now, the brain differences that we're seeing are not consistent with what we see that we're able to change, either with drugs, with learning, with experience. It's become known, and a lot of people do correctly point out that, oh, the brain is not as static as it used to be. That's exactly true. Brain cells can reproduce. We used to think that they could not. But the parts of the brain that can change, and the areas where cells do divide, is in a very specific, very small area in the hippocampus. It's not in the enormous areas of the brain that we found that are related to pedophilia, or at least that my group found were related to pedophilia, nor is it related to the areas of the brain that the two German groups, that one of the German groups studied. The temporal lobe theorist, that is where that set of cells works. We can also now say that pedophiles respond basically in the same way that non-pedophiles respond. It's the same areas of the brain. The areas of the brain that are ultimately responsible for sexual interest. But they respond to stimuli depicting children rather than to the stimuli depicting adults. So to return to our questions, to the big questions, is it in the brain? That's pretty undeniable. Something is in the brain. We don't know any of the details yet, but we can't get away from the idea that pedophilia is something about the brain. Can we treat it? Again, the basic question for, well, it's in the brain, often gives us the idea that, well, therefore we can't treat it. Things in the brain can't be treated. Now, we have to remember the very, very important distinction that often still gets confused between pedophilia and child molestation. Just because we can't change the person's sexual interests doesn't mean that we can't help them change their behavior. So when somebody says, oh, if you can't treat it, you can't do anything, no, that's not what this implies. It implies that I need to do things to help the person. I need to treat the situation the person's in and the life they have. That often, necessarily, if I can't change the brain, I have to help them live with it. I have to help them acknowledge it and deal with it. Sometimes that's a matter of sex drive-reducing meds to take the edge off. For some people, that's a matter of keeping themselves out of harm's way. But the question, can we treat it, we've now slipped between, just because we don't think at this point, the brain data don't suggest that we can change pedophilia, doesn't mean that it can't change a person's propensity to offend, which is actually what we're after. Is it in the genes? Although we don't really have time to talk about it today, there's really only been one genetic study. Now, doing genetic studies requires absolutely enormous samples. The only thing with more data points than the brain is DNA. And so it takes very, very large samples in order to run those studies. And you also need the families and their DNA. That's not going to happen. A lot of the families have, of course, by then dissociated from the offender. Certainly, they're very often their own children, especially for incest offenders. So there hasn't been a lot of work on that. There's been one study that showed that it did seem to run in families. That doesn't necessarily mean it's genetic, but there was something going on that seems to run in families. An example of something that's non-genetic would be, for example, in a family that's very poor. They share an environment from generation to generation, in addition to sharing the genes from generation to generation. So just because it runs in families, which it does seem to, doesn't mean that it's genetic. Were they born with it? Some of the findings suggest that there's no way to explain handedness, and it's a little difficult to explain overall height without going back to prenatal biology. We don't know what it is, and we don't even know if it's necessarily destiny before birth. All we really know, is that the brain was different before birth. We got this basically from handedness, is what said, whatever the chain of events is, the chain begins before birth. There's an old famous saying in brain development. The earlier you catch it, the harder it well, hate when bad things happen to good sentences. Early in a disease, the harder it is to detect, but the easier it is to treat. Later in development, the easier it is to detect, but the harder it is to treat. So if we can find whatever is going on at the beginning of the chain, the beginning of the chain might just be general vulnerability. It might not be specifically pedophilia, and we're just finding somebody with a brain that's trying to compensate for something that went wrong. Maybe it was the mother was exposed to some virus while she was pregnant. Perhaps it was poor prenatal care, vitamin deficiencies, poor nutrition. Any of those things could develop a vulnerable brain, and then something else in addition happens over the course of life to put the person on a course towards pedophilia. So we don't yet know how the whole pipeline works, but the pipe begins, apparently, in the womb. So are they responsible for it? Again, we have to make our division between pedophilia and child molestation. They don't seem to be responsible for what they're attracted to, any more than anybody is responsible for what they're attracted to. But there was nothing in the findings that suggested they're not responsible for their behavior. There were no differences in the frontal parts of the brain, which are predominantly the areas that are responsible for self-control, and which is what led the frontal lobe theorists to start supporting the frontal lobe theories to begin with. So at least the evidence from my lab and from one of the German teams is that that's not there. The people apparently are not responsible for their sexual attractions, but remain entirely responsible, as far as we can see at the moment, for their actual behavior. Which then brings us to probably the most important question. Can we prevent it? Which to me is the most exciting prospect. The more we can pinpoint where in development the thing went wrong, if it's vitamin deficiencies, we can do something about that. We'll not be able to prevent every single case, but if we know what kind of an environment makes pedophilia more likely or less likely, then we can start manipulating the environment long before any of the offenses ever occur. Now, whenever I talk about brain studies in the public, I seem to get this kind of a reaction. For those of you under 40, 5, this was a famous Kubrick film from the early 70s, I guess it was. Essentially, it's touted out as an example of scientists gone wrong, strongly manipulating and putting unwilling people into forcible treatment environments. This particular one actually was, well, they kind of hinted towards the brain, but really it was all about behaviorism, which was the rage at the time. Now, the public often fears the scientists somehow. But really, it's kind of the other way around. For those of you older than 110, these were the Frankenstein villagers charging the castle. Now and then I get that. Where's the, you people with philometries, you're hooking people up to electrodes, somebody got the idea. And somebody starts becoming, we're talking to the brain, you're going to be manipulating the brain, who are you to decide what's a healthy brain versus a not healthy brain? And there's a great deal of hysteria over it. There's something about the brain that feels more, the brain is our heart. It feels it's more like us, and the more we discover it, people kind of feel, pardon the pun, naked about it, and that they're worried about governments, scientists, it's always men in the white coats, it's never a woman in a white coat, manipulating brain development, which people often take as, ethically alarming. But really, when you think about it, the basic medical ethics we already have in place already cover this. We're not getting rid of confidentiality. We're not getting rid of informed consent. Nobody ever will get, nobody is forced to take a phallometric exam, although sometimes the lawyers get involved and there are legal implications of saying yes or saying no. But there's nothing in anything that we're learning or anything that's implied by what we're learning that changes anybody's rights to their treatment or their right to refuse treatment. Now, my hope, of course, is that as we go on, we're going to pinpoint more precisely the exact place where things start to go off. And then we might have the greatest opportunity to change it. It could be something, as I said, like vitamin deficiencies, poor nutrition, some general health factor during the development of the fetus. The better we can find out what that is, the better we can prevent the whole thing from developing in the first place. Which to me is probably the most exciting prospect about doing any of the brain research. Almost all of the research we do is about, of course, preventing recidivism, which makes perfect sense. Once we know who this, once an offender is apprehended, incarcerated, released, and then is ready for rehabilitation and reintegration into the community, we need to know how well that works. But if the brain research is successful, instead of preventing the second offense, we can prevent the first offense, which would be extremely, extremely exciting. Nobody can make any promises about, we're going to have this in 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is. But there are only 3 teams in the world doing this. When I need, and people keep wondering, you need more grant money. No, I need more competitors. There need to be other scientists and other labs looking at this in other different ways. We need to be training more students for it. Now, the comparison I often like to make is the largest of the brain studies, the one that my group did, again, cost the same amount of money as one person in prison. This is cheap and has probably the greatest potential for making the greatest effect, not by preventing reoffending, but by preventing offending. So I just wanted to close on one of my favorite quotes, and I just tripped over it recently. Magnus Hirschfeld, who was also one of the initial sex researchers, he said it in German, but justice through science, which is probably the most exciting prospect that any of us has. And I would also like to acknowledge, they talk about it takes a village. Brain research takes a village. Neurologists, psychologists, statisticians, neuroscience people, sexologists. No one person will ever have the expertise to do these kinds of studies. It takes a whole mess of us. And with that, I hope that kind of allayed people's fears, helped catch you up. I hope I minimized the Latin and the Greek a bit. And if you have any questions, I'm always available on email, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody for the rest of the weekend. Have a great conference, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.